Welcome to Zelda's Peaches and Biscuits podcast. I'm Elena Doughton, the director of the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum.
And I'm Maura Martello. I am a Zelda researcher, a huge fan of hers, and I'm a docent here at the museum.
So we wanted to say welcome back. We had a brief hiatus, and we hope you're all well in the midst of the various COVID lockdowns. In Montgomery, we are in the middle still, but things are slowly beginning to open, so we hope you're well where you are.
We welcome you all.
Yes. So today we're going to talk about Zelda's childhood and some of our favorite stories of her childhood.
Her hijinks.
Yes. We thought it might be fun to, talk about something a little more lighthearted.
Yeah.
So, just for background, we are still using Sara Mayfield's Exiles from Paradise. Mayfield was a close friend of Zelda's in childhood, and I think her novels or her biography is very underrated. But we're kind of using sources along with Milford and other sources for the stories.
Yeah, we have, I brought the Linda Wagner Martin book as well as the Sally Klein book.
Yeah.
Some of them have a lot of mistakes in them. I'm finding as I live here, the longer I live in Montgomery, the more boo-boos I'm finding in these books.
Well, I think a lot of them are geographical.
A lot of them are,
Yeah.
actually, yeah.
And as we found, figuring out the way that the streets have been renumbered, renamed, we find that, just being here, we've been kind of sleuthing around town, but even thankfully when you go to the archives or various places, you realize, wow, the street's been renumbered from the other end. So I think they're not, so far I don't think there's any major.
Well, what do you think about the Pleasant Avenue house? We've been discussing perhaps we've mislocated where the house was. And it's something worth checking out.
It's an open question. If the empty lot where it is assumed the house is, all the description seemed for it to be on the other side of the street, which is an empty area now too. The only thing that kind of perplexes me is we know that there were stairs leading up to the front. And I think that's why people think that those stairs that are still there as the house, because those stairs are there.
Right, on the west side of the street,
Yes,
rather than the east side of the street.
But most of the descriptions seem that that her house would have been on the side with the plantation, which would be on the other side of the street, which it's gone. It's all empty now.
So I think that's something we'll sleuth out, maybe.
Yeah. And if anyone has any questions as we hopefully get back to a more regular schedule with these, send us your questions, because we want to know what questions you have, and as we kind of go through the biographies, we kind of suss out some of the fine details.
Yeah, and also if by chance you are in Montgomery and you know something and you could...
Oh yeah, please let us know.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll also begin to, as things kind of ease back into normal life, we can also do more interviews too, hopefully. And we can do some by phone. So again, today we want to talk about Zelda's childhood. And in rereading it, her childhood seems very, it seems like the childhood I had here. Very, very similar. She had to be in by dark when the street lights come on, or playing at night, like in the summer, and finding fireflies. Or lightning bugs, as we say. It just seems very similar.
Very normal.
Yeah.
Very normal and very unchanged, certainly throughout the entire 20th century. It was the same childhood for most kids in America, I think.
Which I think is lovely, that some things have changed and then some things just seem to be universal.
Yes.
And you just think that childhood play, hopefully, is... In the age that we live in now, and in the neighborhood I live in, kids are still running around, playing hide and go seek. The lightning bugs are out now, and you just think kids are still playing the same way now.
Yeah, are they still collecting them in bottles?
Yeah, we used to do, because you had to punch the holes in the top.
That's right.
Because they have to have
so
air,
they could
and you
breathe.
you were supposed to put grass in them, and then my family, they always let them out at night. When you go to bed, you let them out.
Anyway, I thought, were we going to start with her theatrics as a
Yes.
child?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, of course, in Zelda's home on Pleasant Avenue, she had, I guess there were curtains separating one room from another, and Zelda used those curtains for theatrical purposes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mayfield talks about it, and it says the front and back halls were separated by red velvet portieres, which also serve as stage curtain for Zelda's dramatic performances. And then she says the hallways were lined with all like classics. So what do you think she was actually performing?
I have a feeling if she was anything like, let's say, Jo in Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, she might have been writing her own plays. After all, she was going to grow up to become a writer, so she may also have adapted some of the stories in her father's library. Sir Walter Scott was one of her favorite writers. It's possible she was adapting some of those stories.
Or acting them out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I was telling you before we went on, when I was a child, we would act out what was on the radio. And when I was, I don't know, first grade-ish, Grease, the songs from Grease, and that we would wait for the songs to come on and act them out. And I really wonder if children still do that.
Did you say you were in a treehouse doing that?
Yeah, we had a treehouse, so there were different. We would do different. Which song would come on? I'd be up in the treehouse, and the other kids. We would take turns in the neighborhood, but I was the only girl, so I always got to play Sandy. But we would
happen to find that role for yourself.
But it was fun, and you just think. And we also play hide and seek, and we also would have there would be 15, 20 kids. I lived on a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood, and you'd have all the kids in the neighborhood. And it sounds pretty similar, and you just kind of
an all-American kind of childhood. Now, I have here some of the lists of things that were in the family library. They had, of course, Hansel and Gretel, Alice in Wonderland, as well as Shakespeare, Thackeray, Dickens, Scott, Wilde, Galsworthy, Kipling, Plutarch, Aristotle, Aeschylus, and Gibbons. She read Victorian children's books, gobbled up fiction, and slightly too old for her, popular tales for boys, novels that my sister had left on the table, all I found out about the Civil War. This is obviously a quote of Zelda's. Yeah. So any of those could have been used, I suppose, as a basis for plays.
Also, we know that they had a Victrola. And I think, I'm trying to see if I can find, it's Bach, Brahms, Beethoven, Schumann, Chopin. We know when she comes back in the 30s, she gets some, I think it's at Mendelssohn. Anyway, she gets sheet music to dance to. I wonder if some of these performances were also dance, because she is taking ballet too.
That makes perfect sense, actually. Yeah, she would have been putting on little dance performances as well. She did to start her ballet lessons very early.
Yeah. So it also, I know that we think she's very intrepid, but if you think about the amount of public performances she gave here, both early dance recitals all the way to the big performances in high school, I mean, she was a fairly seasoned performer in terms of being in front of a crowd. Yeah. Everyone talks about, it's very popular now to talk about, you put in your 10,000 hours, or, the Malcolm Gladwell, that people... The Beatles had played 10,000 hours together. But if you think about Zelda, how many hours she would have put in by the time she meets Scott, or that she goes to New York. I get the sense that she was very gifted, and that she was kind of a natural. But in terms of stage presence, she had a lot of hours.
Yeah, she I would agree with that. A lot. Yeah. I also think that this idea that she was just an amateur, I'm not buying into it. It's true that she wasn't paid for these performances, but that in the end, that doesn't really matter. It's how much time you put in. And she was truly a woman who studied ballet very seriously throughout her entire life.
Well, we will talk more about it, and hopefully we can talk to some more dancers. But we have basically put together her dance lineage, and I think a lot of people know she danced with Amelia Harper Rosenberg here, who was a very serious dancer. And we know the different methods that the various teachers that she learned under here in her youth, but also the various teachers who went. What I'm trying to say is her various teachers went to New York. We know who they studied with in New York and then what they brought back. And then we know how serious a dancer and gifted Amelia Harper Rosenberg was. So
Now, who did she study with? Not Zelda, but Amelia.
she
Was it Dennis Shawn?
I don't know. Her husband studied with the Castles, the Vernon Castles. And if you don't know who that is, they basically trained Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire is probably their greatest protege. Vernon Castles died in the war hero. And they basically, like before movies, you would learn a dance, and then it would be in the newspaper, and then they had the how-to books. It's kind of like Martha Stewart's. You're at the movies, you have the newspaper, and then people would buy it as a book. So we know that Amelia's husband had trained with the Castles, and that she had studied the Menzelli. I think it's Menzelli. I don't have it in front of me. Mm-hmm. So we know that Zelda's childhood dance, and then some of her other dance teachers, they all studied in New York. One eventually married. The reason that she goes from teacher to teacher is because they're kind of young women. They're getting married. They're not teachers, and she goes to the next one. And there was a pair of sisters who were trained in New York as well. And I think the other one was the Louis Chalif method, who was the prominent teacher in New York at that time. And so when you look at who her teachers are being trained by, she's learning, albeit secondhand. And then later, Amelia Harper Rosenberg, when the famous picture taken here in the house, Zelda's in the tutu on the chest. At that time, we know that Amelia Harper Rosenberg had trained like 10 or 15 prominent national ballerinas, because it's in the ads. And so that she has people on Broadway, she has people like ballet at the top levels. So I don't think there's any question that Zelda was one quite gifted, because she dances with Amelia Harper Rosenberg. I think Amelia Harper is a little bit between she and Rosalind. So their names come up quite a bit. So I'm wondering if these performances aren't dance performances.
They may very well have been musical comedy of the time. Who knows? I do know that if you look at the photographs of Zelda dancing, whether as a child or as a 16-year-old posing in her mother's garden, there is a beauty that she possesses. And I'm not talking about a pretty face. Obviously, she was a highly trained dancer, just by her body language.
And
you
you
could see it.
also see it when she's at Highland Hospital. There's one where she's standing with a group of women, and just her pose standing, you can tell that there was grace there. And there's one where she's in a pose for the camera, which is hard. It's really hard to tell cameras, because you have to be so still and you get stilted. But just her standing there holding a ball on her hip, you just get a sense
the photo,
of it.
yeah.
And there is one, and I'll see if I
she
can
usually is in, first or second position sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. So I just think we'll tease it. We'll do more on her dance. We'll probably have to do it in a couple episodes, but we are in the process of doing that. But I think you see those early antecedents of her performing in the house for friends. I think this is what, if it was a sports athlete, they call repetitions. And that by the time she meets Scott and by the time she goes to New York, she is a very confident person. I keep reading. They think, this idea that she's just this kind of Southern girl and goes to Grand New York. Well, one, she was much more polished than people, I think, give credit.
I think so.
And again, if you go, you can look on our Instagram or on the show pages. When you see downtown Montgomery and you see New York City, Times Square in 1920, there's not much difference.
Yeah. I agree with that.
I mean, New York starts shooting up
that comes later in the 30s.
In the late 20s, the early 30s. So I think we have this concept of Montgomery today, New York today, and that but she's not.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully we can give a little more historical context.
I
on
think
that.
also sometimes she was self-deprecating. She is in the book Save Me the Waltz, where when she begins studying ballet seriously with Igorova, she takes shots at herself as a young girl dancing. So I think that biographers perhaps take that too seriously. Her own modesty
Yeah.
as a dancer. I'm not sure that I believe Zelda. I think she was a fine dancer from a very early age. I look at the pictures. I see with my own eyes.
And and again, I think the one thing that was very interesting is to look at the quality of the people that she's studying with here in Montgomery are training at the highest level.
Yes. So, what other things did she do as a kid?
Well, I think the reason I like Mayfield so much is that, particularly for the Montgomery years, Sara Mayfield, they were friends. So these aren't stories Sara Mayfield's telling her own stories. And I think the two stories, Mayfield, that you and I both like have to do with skating down, I guess, Sayre Street. And the other was the commandeering of Sara Mayfield's mother's carriage.
Can you read? Is there a part of that you have there about the famous incident when Zelda, at a very young age, maybe 10 years, steals a horse and carriage?
She says that while the coachman was hitching up, we opened the doors to see the steps let down and bounced on the cushions and climbed up on the box. And Zelda was Zelda was a daredevil as well as a tomboy. And she was, let's take a ride. And she goes, all right. And I took the whip. And so essentially Sara Mayfield whips the horses, and it says they plunged. It says, down the driveway we plunged, and had Zelda been as expert with the reins as I was with the whip, that probably would have been our last ride. Luckily for us, she cut too short and turned out of the drive, and the rear wheels struck the carriage block and stopped us long enough for the coachman to overtake us. He caught the reins that Zelda dropped as the jolt all but knocked us off the box, and beyond that, a bent axle, there was no damage done. Except a bent axle's a big deal.
Yes.
Maybe Mayfield doesn't understand.
Let's talk to her parents about that.
Yeah, that's what I thought when reading this. Can you imagine? Because we know Sara Mayfield's father was close friends, was a judge, was close friends with
Anthony Sayre.
Yes,
Judge
Sayre. That they played chess together, and the two girls together. I just don't know. It's like, okay, I'll pay for your repairs.
Maybe.
It's like, no, it's okay. Sara did it too. I'm just wondering how these two men negotiated,
Their children's...
because it says it's what it says in one of his, she's talking about her father, it says in one of his periods of affluence, my grandfather had given my mother an elegant brougham, and a pair of spanking bays. So this is a very expensive, it's like giving someone a sports car.
Yeah, it is.
And then it's like, here's your new BMW, Porsche, and then the kids jump in it and break the axle.
Well, Milford writes that Zelda looked at the carriage and the horses and said, if I had a pumpkin, I could make me one.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is another literary reference, isn't it? To Cinderella, is it?
Yeah. Also in the Milford, it says that, what did she say? When Zelda was done, she popped up. If you have it, it's okay. Because there's a slight variation on the story, and we were looking up the date, is that Milford had interviewed Mayfield in, I think, the 60s. And then Mayfield's book comes out a year or so after Milford's. So there was a slight variation on the
story.
Yeah. It's that Zelda after the carriage comes to a halt. I forget what she said.
I'm trying to find it here. If you can vamp a little.
Okay. The other, what we were talking about, is the skating down the hill, and that Zelda was an expert, and that they would skate down Sayre Street, past the church, past the Chilton School. That's where Zelda would have gone, or is also known as the Sayre Street School. And then they had to stop before they hit the cobblestones in front of the synagogue. And that Zelda was quite expert, but Sarah Mayfield, who was younger, that basically here it is. It says, listen, you'll break your neck. Wait till a dray comes along to pull us back up the hill. Then you can go down holding on to me until you learn how to make the turn. And so she said from then on, I followed after Zelda in the neighborhood games. And the other thing that was interesting is because if they lived on Pleasant Avenue, that's just around the corner from the Sayre Street School. And it says that they went with their nurses. Here it is. Between her house and mine stood the red brick masses and the playgrounds of the Chilton School. The grounds of the school were surrounded by a low wall where our nurses used to sit with us after they had bathed and dressed us for the afternoon. So it's just, you just think it's kind of old Southern with nannies, really. Mm-hmm. She uses the word nurses. And we before the lockdown and whatnot, we went, and that wall is still there behind the church.
Yes, it is.
So we don't know what that playground looked like. It would be interesting.
You have to kind of use your imagination. I have taken the trip from the Sayre Street School down to the synagogue, which is now, the synagogue has since moved to Narrow Lane Road, and it's now a Christian denomination church. It is a little hazardous, and while the cobblestones are gone, you can only imagine how dangerous it would be for a little girl who's just started skating. Yeah. How dangerous it would have been. So Zelda absolutely needed to step in, and she did.
Well, the other side, when we'll put these on the show notes, I was looking up in the newspaper to see what kind of skates they would have had, and it seems like, because I think Sarah Mayfield mentions that her family got her skates. In the newspaper clippings, we found that if you bought a boy's suit, you would get a free pair of skates. So it almost seems like Zelda's skates may have been her brother Tony's skates. That was the question we had. But they seem like that they were the kind of skates that you strapped onto your shoes.
Probably.
So.
And also, I don't know whether they would stretch out or, you could condense them. I'm
the
not
other
sure.
is, I wonder what kind of wheels they had. I mean, were those the weird metal wheels? Or
probably.
I can't imagine.
Very dangerous, to be honest. Very dangerous.
And then she was also known for going down the South Perry Hill, and that's quite a hill as well.
Now that is really dangerous. I'm sorry.
I wouldn't do that on rollerblades today. So
I wouldn't do that on a bicycle. I mean, we're hilly here in Montgomery, and
everything drops. Basically, it's higher land, and then everything begins downtown to slope down to the river. So everything goes downhill from there. Yeah. And so when she uses the word daredevil, it's not an inaccurate, because this isn't just
she
a
was
little
fearless.
Yeah, this is just not a little incline. And the other thing is she was good at it.
Yeah, she was.
Yeah.
And of course, then they would grab onto cars or street cars to lift them back up the hill once they were down.
You think of, if you were to think of little girls today on rollerblades grabbing on the back of either a truck or a car, it was just no. That's what they were doing. So either like horse carriages, but she does say cars. There's in one, and they would have been cars on South Perry Street. Yeah.
Not too many, maybe, but
No.
there would have been some. So she is spending a lot of her time outside doing all kinds of daredevil things. And at night, of course, she was, doing what other kids are doing in the summer. And of course, here in Montgomery, summer is a very long season, and it can even slide as far as into November, warm weather.
Warm weather can slide well up until October.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. The other thing is that in the South, it gets dark very late. So you don't have darkness till 9:30, 10. So when kids are playing out at night, that was the other thing is when we were talking about the honeybees, they're not meeting till like 8, 9 at night. So you just think this lifestyle was one pretty late at night. You know, kids are running around till 9, 10 at night. You have to be in when it gets dark. Well, it's 9:30. Because a lot of we were thinking about having movies on the lawn, but it wouldn't be dark enough here to project on the lawn till like 9, and you don't, you know. So I just think we're a little more conservative about time than they would have been.
Yes.
And the other thing, I wonder in the summer, heat is an issue because it is hot. We talked in earlier, they wouldn't have had air conditioning, or air conditioning was very new. We don't think Zelda had it. And so you're not going to do a lot during the day because you get heat stroke. So, you know, you stay indoors. That's why like a lot of these houses have such high ceilings. So when it
and
cools,
transoms, of course, which pass the air through.
Pass the air through.
Yeah.
So you're going to have much more of a nightlife because it's cooler.
That makes sense to me, actually.
So in that day and age, they would have had electric lights, even if they had. So they're in this kind of nice middle ground. So you wouldn't. I remember as kids, we weren't allowed to play outside from like 11 till 2 because it's just too hot.
That's interesting.
Yeah, particularly well here and in Florida too.
It's blazingly hot here.
Yeah.
Especially if you're living in an area where the sun is directly on your house. I mean, it's just blisteringly hot.
That's the other thing most people don't realize is the difference between dinner and supper.
Explain that. I don't know the difference.
In the South, dinner is often lunch. Like my grandmother, if she said dinner, it was lunch because dinner is the largest meal of the day. So when it's hot, you're eating a big lunch because you're not going out, and then supper is restricted by time. So supper is the evening meal where dinner's the largest. So in the South, you're going to have, like you say, Sunday dinner, it's lunch because it's the largest meal. So in the South, it's kind of like, people know siesta. So that, you know, you work early in the morning, midday, you're inside where it's cooler. You're going to have your big meal midday. Then you have the smaller meal in the evening when it's cooler.
Well, what would a smaller meal mean? Would it be a sandwich, perhaps? Or a glass of milk? No?
It would, maybe something smaller or like tomatoes. I just think, like they said, Zelda she liked to eat tomato sandwiches.
She loved tomatoes, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how she kept her weight back.
Yeah.
The other thing in the South is, and I don't know if they did it, but you have breakfast for dinner. So you're going to have what people think is eggs, bacon, you know, that kind of stuff. You might have that for supper. So so when you talk about the summer and playing outside, it's probably because you couldn't play out in the day, maybe. But then the other thing, though, is you see Mayfield talks about the opening of the pools, so that you had the YMCA pool that had opened. They would slip off. It says to Catoma Creek. I don't know where that is.
Catoma Creek would be heading. That would be heading south. I've actually found it. Yeah? I've actually taken a trip out there. And it would be near the Hyundai
So it'd be out.
Motor Company has its
Hooper.
Yeah, it has a factory out there.
Oh, okay.
So it would be, I think it's outside Montgomery limits. I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, it is still. Yeah. So it'd be out by the airport then. That's kind of a far place to go.
It is a bit of a trip.
But they did have early cars, or they had the buggies. And then she said that they were at the YWCA's musty chlorinated pool, which would have been on South Perry Street. And she said where Zelda had taught me how to dive. That's the question that I'm still curious. How did Zelda learn to swim? Like, who taught her? Who taught her to dive?
Maybe one of her sisters?
Yeah, or we don't know. Did her
brother Tony?
Maybe. Or
did he just throw her in the creek?
But she clearly was. Or did she learn at the Y?
They would have probably given swimming lessons even back then.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Yeah, and so then you eventually have the Oak Park pool, which was much bigger. That's where she was known for going off the high dive. So So
Also, I think there was a quarry. I'm not sure where the quarry was.
I think that one is toward Wetumpka.
So
Where you
we're
have
talking north now, a little bit further north.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Wetumpka, that's what it means. It means the tumbling waters.
Oh, you know what? I'm confusing Wetumpka with Prattville. So, yeah.
Yeah. Because Wetumpka used to have this natural waterfall, and it was called tumbling water. That's what it means, tumbling waters. And I think that's where in her high school yearbook, they go out to some kind of either, not a dam, but I've gone blank.
And they were photographed.
Yeah,
right?
they're photographs. They had their class picnic and they went swimming. So there were a lot of swimming holes. The one thing I find kind of unusual is that Lake Martin, it doesn't figure promently. I mean, it is a man-made lake, but they never, even now it's about a 40, because it's, a little windy road, you have to drive slow. But it takes about 45 minutes now to drive to Lake Martin. But they don't seem to
I've never
swimming.
seen it mentioned in any correspondence.
Yeah.
It is very popular today. Everybody in Montgomery has a home, except me, at Lake Martin.
Yeah, or you go for like a week. So that's where you go when it's hot. You go and float around in the lake. But they didn't seem to. So I wonder when that happened. So moving to the next one, I guess we were talking about when she climbs on the roof. Kind of her more mischievous. And she liked to climb trees, and she there seems to be different. Well, she and fire. We've said that there's this history there, but she says she climbs on the. Well, you go ahead.
Well. Are we talking about
accounts.
There are different times when Zelda did this. She did it as a grown woman once. But as far as I know, she used to, as a child, when there was new construction in town, she would often just climb on the top of the roofs, when it was just basically boards, and would walk along. Now, according to this story, it was her own home in which she called the fire department, claimed that there was a child on the top of the roof, if I'm not mistaken. She then put a ladder up against her own home. God knows where her parents were at this point. Climbs onto the roof and then kicks over the ladder and waits happily for the police and the fire department to show up.
So I was going through the clippings to see if there was any indication, and there was a story, and I'll try to put it on the show notes, that Montgomery had gotten a new fire engine, which I think one was originally a steam engine, and then I guess it may have been horse-drawn, and then they get one that's basically an automobile. Mm-hmm. And that there was a kind of false alarm somewhere along Sara Street. So it would have been in her neighborhood, and there was a little girl involved. And I'm wondering if this gave...
That sounds to me, I don't know, it sounds very suspicious to me.
Well, they gave the address so that there had been a false alarm at a Sara Street address. And I was wondering if this had maybe given Zelda the idea. Because when they go to, is it Connecticut? She does the same thing. But they almost get in trouble for it.
Yeah.
They did not think it was humorous.
Yes, the judge couldn't help her out in that case. Yeah. But I do like the story that when the firemen showed up on the lawn, this is in Connecticut, they ask, where's the fire? And she points to her breasts and says, here.
And then, but they basically wanted to charge them for, a false call.
Yeah.
And so I think she kind of reined it in. The other thing with her being on roofs,
we don't hear too much after that.
Well, you hear the stories that when they lived here at what is now the Fitzgerald Museum, that someone says that she heard a prowler and that was on the roof with a gun. And people kind of say, well, if she, her mental stability, because she was, quote, on the roof. And they assume she's like climbing on the roof.
Well, that's what I assumed for years.
But when you come to the house, you don't realize that this had like a second story veranda, so that you would walk out onto the roof from the house, from the second story. And we know that their bedrooms, they would have stayed upstairs. So if there is, it's now enclosed. When the house was renovated in 34 after they lived here, they enclosed that veranda, and that becomes part of the kitchen dining room because they split it into the 4 apartments, and then they added the sunroom, and then it had a new outdoor veranda. So if she's on the roof, she's not literally walking along the rooftop.
On a slanted rooftop.
She's on the second
she's
story
on a
porch.
veranda.
Yeah. So that's the thing that I find very interesting about the various stories and folklore around her is people will tell the story as if it's evidence of her mental state. Well, she was on the roof. And you find out, no, there was a veranda up there. So I think, and I think that's what you have to be very careful as a historian. And my sympathies lie with the biographers because it's really hard. Like if you're collecting all these stories, but you haven't been, like you can't go to some of these houses. You can't, like us now, we're here in the house and we know that. You can't put the geography together. You can't go look here. Or I would say as a historian, you have to go to the places if you can find them.
Yeah. Well, that's why we're here to debunk all these.
Yes. Well, I think it's just to give clarity because you have to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with history is if you have enough, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you have enough pieces, it's a picture of kittens or a mountain or whatever. You don't have to fill it all in. But if you can, sometimes the assumptions you make are actually incorrect.
It's like getting back to the Pleasant Avenue house. Now I was so sure that it was located in one area, and now I'm questioning. And we know it's on Pleasant Avenue. That's, but it's interesting. You have to constantly keep aware.
Yeah, and that's also the thing is that I think Milford, particularly for its time, is a great first step. But there were limits to what she was able to do, and I think it's because a lot of Alabama or Montgomeryans weren't helpful. But now, also, she didn't have the same amount of, or a lot of the biographers of what we have now in terms of his newspaper.
Yeah,
like the clippings that we have, and also now that archives are digitized, like the Alabama State Archives, all these and other. The fact that we can sit there, you can go to Princeton's archive and flip digitally through.
Yeah, you can do that online.
Yeah, so
right now. Look at the photos.
And I've been to Princeton twice, and you're in this room, and you sit there, all day or anyway, and there's a lot of pressure, and you can't take the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in terms of scholarship, you can see how things. And then you make notes. You're like, okay, I'll remember, because you're just trying to get as much information as possible because you can only get while you're sitting there.
Mistakes are going to happen. It's only natural.
But I think that the more that we can figure out here, I think the clearer the picture we get. And I think
something you mentioned quite a bit is that how a biographer will make one mistake and then it gets carried forward in all the other biographies and histories.
Then they start. You read the. You kind of go backwards and you think, okay, that person went to Princeton and then they've made this statement. And then this person didn't go to Princeton, so they have quoted this source.
Yeah.
And then you read and you start reading and the biographies begin to quote each other. So I would say if you're going to write a biography, try to start from zero. I know it's hard. Like that's what we're trying to do. And that's why I think we have so much more information now, particularly the years before Scott here in Montgomery, and then the enormous amount that we're finding of her life after Scott's death here.
Which is all very interesting. So what else did she do? Did we talk about the Nooney story, which is sort of akin to getting up on a roof?
I think it's we both have a fascination with Nooney.
Yeah.
I think Nooney must have been very kind and long-suffering.
Nooney, of course, was Marjorie's daughter, her sister Marjorie's daughter, but they were quite close in age. I mean, there's how many years? Like a 5 or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a little more,
maybe
8 or
9,
more. But they were close enough in age that they were playmates, or Zelda was put in charge of her.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a 12, 14-year-old, maybe. And then I think they remained friends till the end. They seem to be very close. So what did Zelda do to poor Noonie?
Well, I guess Zelda had wanted to go to town, downtown Montgomery. Now, I'm not sure. In my mind, she's always going to a candy store or a
movie.
Okay.
I think she went to a movie.
Yeah.
That's because that gave me a sense of time. Like,
right, a couple of hours,
maybe.
maybe.
Did you leave this kid?
So she puts Noonie up a tree. She just and says, "Don't move, and I'll be right back." And then she leaves Noonie, who's now up a tree, undoubtedly crying. And I think the promise was that she would bring her back candy.
Yeah, and then she brought her back, I think in Mayfield, it says she brought her back peppermints.
From May's Confectionery, I think. Yeah, which is long gone.
The other thing that Mayfield talks about is how Zelda was such a compassionate child. I just like.
All right, so there's a few gaps.
Yeah, and then here it is. It says Zelda was ingenious as well as quick-witted. She invented a novel way of escaping the tedium of babysitting Noonie, her young niece, by climbing up a tree and leaving her there too high for the little girl to come down alone. "Listen," she would say, "you just stay right here till I get back and I'll buy you some candy." And then she would go off to a movie. And you get the sense that this happened more than once. So kind of shade on Noonie. Like, I ain't going up any trees with Zelda. Hey, let's go up the tree. But also, I just think, like, we climb trees, and I can try to think of all the kids I knew who fell out of a tree and broke an arm or
chipped a tooth.
Yeah, we all had tree houses and of varying quality. And I don't know that kids. I just think the playground that I played on in the early 80s. Just a hazard zone.
Yeah.
Metal slides and the heat and
I always think
and
it was
how high the bars were and
I always thought because families in the old days had so many kids that you lost one fell on its head, there was 9 more.
Well, you think about the mortality rates of children. Zelda, the child, I guess, was it before Anthony died at 2
Daniel,
years old?
yes, Daniel
meningitis. So a lot of these families, it wasn't, and then just after the war, I mean, you think the mortality rate for children was high. So, and you just think the Victorian era and the attitude towards death. That's something I guess we haven't really considered is that era's attitude towards death was much different.
They fetishized it, really.
But the other thing that I find very disconcerting when discussing, a lot of biographers will talk about Zelda's mental health, and they'll claim it's hereditary and that her mother had mental health issues. Then you find out she was a mother who lost a 2-year-old. I mean, grief is not mental health. And then, there is a question that we haven't been able to research a lot, but the idea that Tony did not commit suicide. In Rosalind's notes, she said that he had malaria. He had delirium from malaria. So that his falling from a first-story window wasn't.
Yeah, he was an engineer, and I think he designed bridges or worked on bridges, and he had been working in a swampy area of the United States.
But in the Mayfield papers, you can read, when she's reading the page, you can tell her incredulity that they're like, he did not commit suicide. He had malaria. Like, no one kills themselves by falling out of a first-story window. It didn't even, that was her thing. It doesn't even make sense. And so all the points where they say that, well, there were mental health issues, her brother was suicidal, I think there may have been an elderly aunt or something.
Well, I was just reading one of the books where Mrs. Sayre, that would have been Minnie Machen Sayre, Zelda's mother, claimed that it was the Morgan blood was pestilence, and that it created bad nerves.
Yeah, and the other one was that I forget which, they said that Marjorie, the sister Marjorie, not Noonie, but that she was somehow fragile or nervous. But there seems to, I haven't found there's nothing that indicates that or substantiates it.
Yeah.
Because and I think what we were talking about is that Noonie dies her husband dies, her daughter dies, her mother dies, and then she dies. It's like she has the 2 year, like the grief of the 2 year. But there's nothing that indicates that Marjorie was actually fragile in any way.
Yeah, it is something that appears in the books, but there is no evidence provided.
No, and in fact, everything that we found in the clippings is that Marjorie and Rosalind, Marjorie I think was the most conventional here, that she had been a teacher, which was unconventional that both Marjorie and Rosalind worked when they didn't have to. And so she was a teacher. She was like valedictorian. She seemed to be very much into bridge, very social people. So there's no indication that she had this, you couldn't organize all these charities and parties and constant, so to be as active as they were and somehow be fragile.
Yeah, I agree with that. What else?
So talking about fragility, what about Tallulah, the last one? Tallulah Bankhead, her aunt again was Marie Bankhead Owen. Her mother had died, and Tallulah spent quite a lot of time here in Montgomery.
Was she really from Birmingham originally? I think so, but
yeah, it was Birmingham, but I want to say Tullahoma too. Is that correct? Like the family home was there, but even it says who was then living in Montgomery with her aunt, and that would have been Marie Bankhead Owen. Her mother had died, and I think she would spend summer here as well. And so, Sara Mayfield's father was a judge and worked in the Capitol building along with Zelda's father. And then Marie Bankhead Owen and her husband, they were the founders and were the first two directors of the state archives. And their office was also in the Capitol building. So this is why you have these little girls running around the Capitol building, is because their parents or guardians are working there. So this is why, and Mayfield talks about how the Capitol grounds, now the hill that the Capitol sits on is called Goat Hill. It was originally, they had goats there. Then the Capitol was placed there, and Mayfield says that it was more of a playground for them as children than Oak Park or Pickett Springs. And it's still very beautiful today. I don't know that you would run around it as much. She says that they had the form of cannonballs stacked up. I know the Confederate Monument is still there. It's a very tall column, and it has like sailors. It's for its time, it's particularly impressive.
It is. It's quite large.
It's quite large. It's on the north side.
Yeah.
So it would have been, similar to what you would have seen in larger cities. And then the other thing is the Alabama State Capitol staircases. They were actually designed by an engineer who was a free slave, and they look like they're cantilevered. And I think they're the only ones left in the world of their kind because there's no visible support. So they just kind of look like they're floating outward.
And they're magnificent. I mean, it's just no other word to describe it.
So when you go on the school tour like we did, they were designed by an African-American engineer. But I think there was a building in France which has since burned since I was a child. So they're the only ones remaining, but they're these beautiful semicircular kind of spiraling staircases. And so the lore is that she and Tallulah, we know that they would slide down the banisters. And then like a lot of things like Zelda, did she skinny dip or was it a nude bathing suit? They would say that they would slide down and you could see their undies. Or some would say, people ask, did they really slide down with no undies at all? Which, given Tallulah and Zelda,
anything goes.
Yeah, it's very possible.
She was from Huntsville, actually. She was born in
Huntsville.
Yeah.
So she, and then also Mayfield talks about how Tallulah, that Sara Mayfield and Tallulah had gone to Miss Gussie Woodruff's school, and then to the Margaret Booth School, which I hadn't realized Margaret Bruce School was kind of across the street from the
Sayre Street School, yeah.
So that they would all have been in this neighborhood. But the reason that you have these little girls playing in and around the Capitol building is that, all the adults were working there. The other thing is that she and Tallulah, they would dance up and down the stairs, which, they're great marble stairs which lead up to the Capitol steps. And then at that time, you would have had the trolley cars running from the top of the Capitol down to the Court Square fountain. So they were also known for acting like conductors on the trams, which might be funny, but might also not be. I mean, if you're riding the tram and these girls like, hey,
yeah, I believe Zelda as a teenager actually took over driving one.
She might have.
Yeah.
And then they were also known for,
she probably did it well, too, knowing her.
Holding court at the Court Square fountain. So basically, she and Tallulah, and again, if you think Tallulah was known for doing the cartwheels in front of the Capitol building. And if you think about stage presence and performing publicly, we know Tallulah goes on to, has a very storied acting career. But I don't think you can really underestimate. You can't, on the one hand, say, well, look, Tallulah was the local lore is that she gave her first performance when the Wright brothers were visiting here in Montgomery, in her aunt's parlor. That's the, and so you have these two very comparable women who are kind of performing publicly, and if anything, Zelda was performing more on stage and in dance than Tallulah. Tallulah won the photo contest.
Right.
Yeah. And was discovered that way. So in a way, Zelda may have had more performance time than Tallulah. So again, you look at Zelda as very adjacent to a lot of these people that. And again, the thing with all the biographies that I find lacking is that there's no real sense of the women that she knew in Montgomery before she meets Scott Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
She knows Tallulah. Tallulah was, 16 when she's discovered? She's on Broadway. It's by like 18. So and I think there's a clipping where there is an ad or there's a mention of Tallulah being on the stage, and then there's also Zelda performing on I'll look it up, but they're in the Montgomery Advertiser together, Zelda locally, Tallulah in New York.
Nationally, yeah.
But then if you think again, I've gone blank, Anne Goldwaite, the painter, internationally known painter.
Sarah Hart.
Sara Hart is now, by the time that they're teens, is at Goucher, and then Sarah Mayfield goes, and she, and then you just think her mother had been published, I think more regionally, not nationally, but her mother had an offer from the Barrymores. And then
that's Minnie Match and Sarah.
Match, yeah. And then you think Kate Salter McKinney has published nationally. I mean, you just think in every field that she eventually, and then you think of her dance teachers are all coming back, studying New York, coming back. So every area of creativity that we think of Zelda, where it be a writer, a dancer, a painter, or even maybe an actress, before she meets Scott Fitzgerald, she knows a woman that has been successful nationally or internationally at that level.
Yeah, she became Tallulah became a great star in London.
Yeah.
She just burst into celebrity. Yes, which plays against this idea that Scott, kind of lifted her out of small town life and then projected her onto the world. But as we know, she was a star in her own right.
Yeah, and the other reason I say it just shows that what she thought was possible. A lot of times I think they think, well, she hitched her wagon to him. I think that they were two people that found each other.
Yeah.
But that the idea of doing any of these things, because shortly after their marriage, we also found that she met Billy. I'm really bad with names today. The wife of the Ziegfeld Follies.
Billy Burke.
Billy Burke. So that she meets with Billy Burke shortly after their marriage in New York. And again, Billy Burke is head of the Folly. I mean, she's
a great great Ziegfeld star, as well as
Yes.
being the wife of Ziegfeld.
Well,
You know her from, she's the good witch
yes,
in The Wizard
Glinda.
of Oz.
Yes. So you just think that Zelda knew all of these women who had been successful in these areas, and she was their peer or, contemporary in some ways, or, her mother's. And so that the idea that she could attain these things wasn't fantasy.
No.
And the other thing is, it's one thing to think, well, I have this talent, I can do it. She also knew people who could open those doors. That when you meet, the head of the Follies, when she said, when Scott interviews her in 23 and says, if you had to earn your own living, what would you do? And she says, well, I would dance in the Follies. Well, because she knew who to
contact.
Yeah, who to contact. So it's kind of like saying, well, she knew she had an agent. Like today, you go, well, I'm a great dancer, I'll go to Broadway. Well, you got to.
I think it was the reporter, Adela St. John's, who was a Hollywood reporter, said that Zelda at any time could have appeared in the Follies. She talked about her great beauty and her sense of style. She just chose not to.
Yeah, and that's the question moving forward that I don't think I've answered is why didn't she? Because she, in terms of dance and what I've been looking at, the difference between she and Amelia Harper Rosenberg is that Amelia Harper Rosenberg becomes a serious dancer and then segues into becoming a teacher, because that's what a lot of great ballerinas do is, the life of a dancer is somewhat short, but then you think Igorova, she becomes the top teacher.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of the question that's always there. In terms of the dance, there's two questions that I haven't really have an answer for yet, is why didn't Zelda do more modern dance like Duncan? Why Isadora Duncan? Why did she pursue classical ballet so heavily? And I don't know that we get I haven't found a plausible answer for that.
Or the great Martha Graham.
But I think, in a way, I was thinking it was probably more economic, that had she had left Scott, which we know that I think had Save Me the Waltz been financially successful, she would have left Scott. But it didn't. That's my opinion. Yeah. And then I think she could have become a dance teacher, which, that is one of the few avenues I think women at that time could be independent. Yeah, it wasn't, and that she could have had some kind of not just competency, but celebrity. I have a number of friends who are now, I went to university with, who danced on Broadway. In fact, two are men, but, having danced on Broadway, one was nominated, and now they're dance teachers. Mm-hmm. So that would have been, I think, a very good avenue for her. And that was the other question. Why did that not happen? Because that would have been a very good avenue for her.
I agree with that. Well, I don't want to get down on Scott Fitzgerald. We're having such a good time here, and, he supported her financially. But I believe that both Gerald Murphy and Scott Fitzgerald got down on her about the ballet. Her, Igorova, Gerald Murphy saw her dance at a rehearsal on a slanted stage and was not impressed. I
think they were jealous.
They may have been. The thing that bothers me is that he was showing such naivete because he thought that her legs looked ugly as she was moving around the dance floor. But if you ever go backstage at a ballet performance, and I've been backstage many times at the Met to see ABT, American Ballet Theater, one of the great theater companies in America, the thing that will hit you immediately is those sylphs who you see in the Nutcracker. Backstage are hulking chicks with big legs.
The only thing worse is just Google dancer feet. One of my first jobs, I was a dresser for a dance company, and they are
they're athletes.
Oh, they're athletes, and some of the most frightening feet. 'Cause, if you shove that foot in that toe shoe, most dancers are like shaking their head yes. But I think the thing with Gerald Murphy and Scott is, I think there clearly was a jealousy because Scott accuses her of being in love with Igorova. And I think we will try to have, I know I've talked to a couple dancers and we'll see if we'll interview them about how they think that her adoration of her teacher is just very normal. That they have had that same adoration. And I think a lot of people like in sports understand the relationship between a coach and a player often, it's kind of like father-son maybe. But that it's like that. And I have the feeling that Gerald Murphy was very jealous of her, particularly when it comes to painting, because my research is on her abilities as a painter. When you look at, because he studied under Goncharova, who was a Russian painter who's painting with the Ballet Russe, who's doing costumes, who I'm doing a lot of research on now. And then you look at Zelda's artwork, and if you look at her as maybe one of the influences, because Gerald Murphy took art lessons from her, we know that. And we know that Zelda saw her and saw her costumes. And then when you compare their art, Zelda, I would say, is the better artist. His stuff looks like illustration to me.
It's like posters.
Yes.
I happen to like Gerald Murphy's work.
I like his work, but when you
It's
look
very different than hers.
his is very sterile, very flat. It almost looks, I'm not saying it's bad, but I just think when you look at his stuff, immediately the argument which differentiates illustration and art comes to mind. And that, in the art world, in the art circle, in the art history, there is that dividing line. Is illustration art? Is photography art? But his stuff to me just looks so much like illustration. They would have made great travel posters, and it's it's the kind that you'd want to have.
Exactly.
But they're kind of sterile. They're very flat. If you think they would have known Leger at that time, and so and this is what a lot of my research is on right now in her art, is that I think she was definitely the better painter. And if you consider, Scott with Tender as the Night, he uses them. They were very upset. I think particularly Sarah Murphy was very upset that he had used them for Tender as the Night. I mean, let's face it, they could misbehave. And so you have this couple who's kind of out there.
It's unfortunate. Some of their friends did turn on them,
Yeah, and then
Hemingway, and of course, being the most famous example, in a brutal way.
So I know that we kind of veered off from her childhood there,
yes.
but hopefully that is something that we'll be looking up in times to come. But so are there any last childhood things?
I think we covered it pretty much. I have there
was one last thing that I did think was funny, because I kind of always refer back to my grandmother because she was here at the time. It says Zelda shrugged off. This is in Mayfield. Zelda shrugged off her father's reprimands with a light-hearted ishkabibble, for he was not the stern disciplinarian that he has been depicted as being. But just that phrase, my grandmother would say ishkabibble. And like for my granddad, who was stationed here in the war, he would say ishkabibble, or she'd go kibble kibble. But like ishkabibble, I just think I don't know if that's a Southern phrase or if it was, I don't know. But when I read it, I just know that people here in Montgomery, it was like, how you go, psst, or you always see it. But the fact that she would say ishkabibble, I
we'll
think
have to find the origin of it.
Yeah, it's just maybe a regional thing.
It's like the word boodler, which Milford insists is a regionalism from. And in fact, I was telling Alana that I was watching The Music Man, which is set in Iowa, and it was written by Meredith Willson, who was Iowan. And the actor who plays Mayor Shin talks about boodling.
Yeah, boodling, yeah.
And I thought, see, I always thought it was a national you know,
I
something.
think it was because I think locally we tried to see if we could find any reference in the newspapers, and boodling had to do with like a political maneuvering of some kind.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But that's not what Boodler's Bend. Boodler's Bend is like a makeout spot. We haven't found it yet. So
We're looking.
If you know where Boodler's Bend was,
Please call us.
yes, I think. Please let us know, because Mayfield says that it was at the end of the
Court Street.
Court Street and a pecan grove, but that it was on a curve.
Right.
And I think if she maybe got the axis wrong, it may be where Vaughan Road Park is, because that was all, because it's the curve was there.
Yeah. If you look at a map, Court Street is straight. There is a curve, though, on Norman Bridge Road. I don't know.
Yeah. So if you can help us with Boodler's Bend,
We'd
that's
love to
one
get
of
to the
many-
bottom of that.
The many mysteries we're trying to unravel. So that will wrap it up. If you will, go to our show pages. We'll have various pictures and stuff as normal there. And if you have any questions, please let us know. And in terms of visiting the museum, please check our website. We're kind of appointment only because the house has limited space in the Alabama is still under the Safer at Home, so we're required to have masks. And in order to have social distancing per family, per room, we're letting people in because the rooms are small. You can't be 6 feet with a lot of people. So when you arrive, just call. And then depending how many people are here, we're just kind of cycling people through. But we are open for limited hours for July, and then depending on what happens in the state of the world, we'll probably expand a little more. And we'll see you next time.